Заступник пішов!
Ukrainian forces are advancing steadily across the vast fields of the east of the country. Between hills worn down by war and villages reduced to rubble, they make the weight of their power felt against the ferocious invader. The Russians are a fearsome enemy and have conquered many territories, but the 3rd Assault Brigade is Kyiv's great hope. A highly battle-ready troop that is about to put its fame to the test. The big goal, to recover Andriivka. This small town is located in the region where the bloodiest fighting of the war has taken place, and now it will be the scene of a brutal revenge. In this new video from Military Force, we will delve into the incredible clashes that turned Andriivka into one of the symbols of the struggle of the Ukrainian people, determined to challenge the invading giant until the end. Get ready for this epic battle, because here we come.
Ну, братан, якщо зв'язки йдемо на вас, то не наш.
Оп, оп. Бля. О! Да, ти.
The winter of 2022 marked the beginning of the storm. On February 24th of that year, Russian President Vladimir Putin gave the order to advance his troops, who were waiting on the border. The army did not hesitate to cross the country's borders and launched a brutal invasion on Ukrainian soil. Moscow's troops began their journey with overwhelming force that quickly expanded through the Donbass. This region includes the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, which have been a source of conflict for a decade between the two countries. There, the presence of pro-Russian separatist movements has led to violent clashes with ultra-nationalist groups in Ukraine. These confrontations were the spark needed to ignite a true hell. During the first months of the invasion, the Kremlin soldiers advanced like a locomotive without brakes, unstoppable, uncontrollable. The Ukrainian defenses were fierce, but there was no point. The Russian troops simply swept away everything in their path. In August 2022, the city reached the outskirts of Bakhmut. As Kyiv's forces launched a large-scale counteroffensive to recapture Russian-occupied territory in Kharkiv and Kherson, this city in the Donetsk region became the main scene of the battle. However, this was not just any confrontation. Some of the wildest fighting of the war so far would take place here.
Браво! За М-кою! За М-кою! Накид! Давай! А наші спереду чи ні? Да! Давай вправо уходим! Вправо! Туда вправо! Уходьте, блядь! Двойка пішла!
Russian troops gradually gained ground, and by February 2023 they had captured a large area of territory in the north and south of Bakhmut. Based on these gains, they formed a powerful artillery ring around their positions, forcing the Ukrainian forces to slowly retreat. The battle turned into an urban war where the locals increasingly lost ground. A month later, the Kremlin soldiers finished controlling the different corners that still had a local presence. The advance did not stop, and the Ukrainians were limited to a tiny strip on the outskirts of the city. The Russian generals looked at the map and marked a small town on their strategic board. That point would serve to consolidate their progress to the west, where Bakhmut resisted like a fortress. What place are we talking about? None other than Andriivka. A coordinated offensive by Moscow's troops was enough to eliminate the enemy's opposition and place its tricolor flag on the streets. Putin's army dug in there, turning the village into a stronghold. From this location, they could protect vital routes into the area where the war was still being fought house by house. Soon, the buildings were in ruins, and the daily life of Ukrainian citizens disappeared, replaced by the constant echo of explosions and the sound of rifles firing without rest. For the Russian soldiers, it was nothing more than a new position in the midst of conquest. But for the defenders of Ukraine, this small town meant much more. It was the gateway to the heart of their country. As they watched from the hills as their lands were invaded, a single thought inhabited their minds. To win the war, they would one day have to regain control of the city. However, it would not be an easy task. Every street was mined, every building had become a rival bunker. There was only one group of men capable of fulfilling that task: the 3rd Assault Brigade.
Давай, нашпіговуй туди.
Настріль.
Ще одну кидку ногами.
The brigade was officially formed in 2022 as part of the measures taken by the government in Kyiv to deal with the war after the Russian invasion. However, it also owes its origin to a well-known paramilitary group with a controversial previous history. This is the Azov Battalion, a troop of ultranationalist fighters criticized by Moscow. These Ukrainian warriors were savage in the clashes against the aforementioned separatist movements in the Donbas region, and were known to be related to a neo-Nazi ideology due to their hatred of the Russians and those who supported them. Despite these controversies, the brave members of the group proved to be an extremely effective unit in combat, with arduous training and unparalleled bravery. This motivated the Ukrainian authorities to finally design the 3rd Assault Brigade, which was integrated with many of the former soldiers of the old Azov Battalion and other veterans of the conflict that both countries have maintained for more than 10 years. The force's revamp allowed it to move away from criticism, for example, by leaving behind issues such as an old shield that Russia claimed had references to Nazi symbolism. Once the controversies were over, the Ukrainian defense began to have a unit specifically designed for assault missions, with a focus on mobility, close combat, and offensive operations in difficult terrain. The brigade is also distinguished by being equipped with modern weapons, light armored vehicles, and equipment for urban combat, making it ideal for raids on cities seeking to recover after falling into enemy hands. Throughout the conflict, these troops have demonstrated their high value by carrying out quick attacks that surprise the rival and thwart any Kremlin plans. For these reasons, they were chosen for the battle in Andriivka. Ukraine wanted to recover a key territory, and the 3rd Assault Brigade was its best option. By May 2023, 9 long months had passed since the beginning of fighting in and around Bakhmut. Ukraine's allies, such as the United States, which donated a large amount of weapons to the country's troops, informed Kiev that continuing fighting in that region was useless. They pointed out that all they would achieve was to continue losing men and spilling blood on the streets. But the warnings were not heeded. Local soldiers were not ready to surrender. On the contrary, they were beginning a new counterattack. The 3rd Assault Brigade began its participation using different tactics. They included ambushes, coordinated advances to destroy fortified positions and buildings, and concentrated fire on small groups of Russian occupiers who were taken by surprise and forced to abandon previously conquered territory. During its operations, the unit used drones for reconnaissance and planning of its brutal attacks with soldiers and armored vehicles. The use of this technology allowed Ukrainian forces to gain real-time intelligence on enemy positions and adjust their strategies accordingly, which was crucial in the changing and highly dynamic environment of the battle. These methods proved effective in inflicting casualties on the opponent and maintaining the initiative on the ground. But on the other side was a powerful adversary who was also unwilling to lose. Noticing the growth of the Ukrainian counteroffensive, the Russians reinforced their positions and began to increase their firepower in the area. In this way, the duels became increasingly intense and dangerous.
Братан, я там простреливал, и там отработал миномет, там шла пидорская группа, держали вот эту всю часть. Сейчас там нету, это было, блядь, еще минут 20 назад, все нормально. Нет, я простреливал весь этот сектор.
With the clear objective of recapturing Andriivka at any cost, Ukrainian forces entered the city under a hail of shells. The Russian trenches that had been dug in great detail to hinder the advance of their rivals were not enough to stop the momentum of the local soldiers. Each step was charged with a mixture of fury and hope. The defense of the occupied territory had as its main protagonist the 72nd Mechanized Brigade of the Russian Federation. This powerful unit made up of tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and self-propelled howitzers had been key in the war in Donbass. Its firepower was incredible and could defeat any enemy. But this time, a devastating troop was on the opposite side. Both the skill and the attitude of the 3rd Ukrainian Assault Brigade were soon reflected in the field. So much so that the Russian company found itself at a deadly crossroads after losing one of its commanders.
Пацани, його треба затягувати, тут не стоять десь.
Просто ударив осколка.
Дрони.
Дрони, блядь, автомати в руки.
Дроїд на зв'язку, хто викликає.
The Kiev soldiers went all out. They penetrated the enemy's defenses to the point of encountering one of the Russian high commanders, who was leading the force that was trying to resist. Andriivka was no longer just another battlefield. It had become an example of the ferocity of the Ukrainian fighters. The fighting reached a brutality never before seen in the conflict. The 3rd Assault Brigade was unstoppable and only left Russian corpses behind in its advance. In this way, the Ukrainian warriors were clearing every part of the small city until they met the leader of one of the Moscow battalions. This was a symbol of the success that the locals were achieving, getting closer and closer to delivering a hard blow and achieving a necessary victory.
Майор чого?
У нас поранений пленний.
Майор чого?
Позивний Ява, да, командира? Командира Ява? Звання. Полковник?
The capture of this high-ranking officer would allow the Ukrainian brigade to gain information about enemy positions or strategies in the fight for Andriivka. With the temperature of the fighting rising ever higher, the Russian troops found themselves at a crossroads. They no longer had any clear advantage, and instead, a fierce rival kept getting closer. After a deep debate about the next step to take, the leaders in Moscow surprised everyone with their decision. Yevgeny Prigozhin, the then commander of the Wagner Group, a paramilitary unit fighting in the region alongside Kremlin forces, told the media that Russian troops were fleeing. "They took their things and just left," said the warrior, bewildered by the actions of his country's 72nd Mechanized Brigade. That striking episode occurred after Ukrainian soldiers eliminated 64 enemy combatants and wounded another 87 in just 2 days. These quickly added to the high number of fatalities since the brigade's arrival. The death toll among the invading forces rose to 500. The overwhelming counterattack of the Ukrainian unit was about to achieve its goal, but it still wanted revenge. So, as the Moscow armored convoy moved away firing to cover the fleeing soldiers, local fighters tried to catch up with them. Meanwhile, the few Russians who still remained in the city in the hope of holding a defensive position faced brutal death.
Мы знаем, что группа авангарда находится сейчас в 2 домах, и мы предлагаем вам сдаться.
On September 14th, 2023, the dawn was different in Andriivka. The first rays of sunlight no longer illuminated a foreign flag. That symbol of the invasion had been thrown to the ground and burned by the fire of the Ukrainian soldiers. Meanwhile, the exhausted and wounded Russian troops continued their retreat. The blue and yellow banner flew again as a message of an important triumph for the spirit of the locals. The news of the liberation of the city quickly reached every corner of the country. The fierce warriors who survived told stories of a fierce fight and exalted the figure of those comrades who had not hesitated to give their lives for that piece of land. Andriivka, although it was a very small point on maps and great strategists in times of peace, had become a symbol of the war. Its liberation was more than a military victory. It was a demonstration of Ukraine's ability to resist a powerful, larger, and better armed enemy. There is no doubt that the names of those who fought in this city will remain engraved in the country's history. However, the war is far from over. On the contrary, it is becoming increasingly challenging. Two and a half years into the conflict, the battle has become a war of attrition where the size difference between Ukraine and Russia becomes more evident. Moscow's vast arsenal is prepared to maintain the offensive for much longer, while at this point, Kyiv depends almost exclusively on the military aid that can arrive from its allies. And another issue of no less importance has to do with the human factor. A powerful unit like the 3rd Assault Brigade that we have seen in action during this video has a limited number of soldiers compared to the forces of a country with a population 4 times larger. The Kremlin has managed to reinforce its ranks with new recruits, while the Ukrainians are suffering in this aspect. Still, victories like Andriivka keep the spirits of Kyiv high, which has shown that it will never give up the battle for its freedom. Now, after having learned the history of these brutal clashes between Russians and Ukrainians, it is time to say goodbye. Thank you very much for staying with us until the end. We look forward to seeing you again in our next military force video.